Hi guys, thanks for the waiting. Well, this is part 5 of What If Kamen Rider Para DX was in RWBY. So let's start. Chapter 7, Lies We Tell. First person POV dash. There it is, that's the kicker. I thought to myself as Ashbin's question played in my mind over and over for what felt like hours. I knew he was suspicious, but I didn't think he'd catch on that quickly. Oh well, there goes keeping a secret from a literal immortal man. I simply sighed out of a cross between frustration and oddly enough relief, as I now knew I'd have someone to relinquish any information to. The problem, however, was making sure he could keep to his word. I looked up at him with a blank expression as I asked him, "So, what gave me away?" "You mean aside from the fact that your name coincided perfectly with our color naming tradition despite claiming to be from outside the Four Kingdoms?" he asked right back at me. As I thought about it, I soon realized how much of an idiot I was. I left myself completely wide open for that one. I decided this had to be the moment I gave him the benefit of the doubt and confront him. "Before I answer your earlier question, I need a favor of you," I said. He continued to look at me in his usual stoic gaze for a moment before nodding. "Whatever I say in this room stays in this room. If anyone else knew this, the results would be disastrous, more so than they already are, and I am not joking nor making threats." He simply nodded once more before motioning me to continue. "Okay. Here goes nothing. My name," I began, "isn't Dichrospectrum, as you have already surmised. It's actually Stephen Richardson. I chose the name Dichrospectrum in order to try and blend in with the locals if contact was all but completely unavoidable. You can tell how that turned out." So what were you doing in the Emerald Forest?" Ashbin asked me as he typed something on a panel, most likely recording whatever I say and testing it against some form of lie detector. "I was merely trying to survive until I could find a way back home." "So you truly were stranded in the Emerald Forest dash?" "Not entirely, sir." He looked at me with an eyebrow slightly raised as I tried to explain. While I had no idea where I was in the forest itself, nor when in time I was, I had not actively sought out civilization for some rather complicated reasons. He continued to stare at me as if waiting for me to continue before I nodded. "This is why I said for everything I say here to remain in this room. You see, I never really lied when I said I was from outside the Four Kingdoms. But I didn't tell the entire truth. I'm not even from Remnant at all." This had him raising both his eyebrows in surprise. Wow, that is so awkward to look at, but, alas, I continued my story. "Where I come from? Remnant. The Grim. Everything here was a web show there for our entertainment." Ashbin's look of shock was soon replaced with a rage that made even me cringe, but I still had more, so I tried to hold my hands up and asked him, "Whoa, don't go attacking me just yet, okay? I can prove it. Beneath the school is a place called the Vault where the Fall Maiden, who has had a run-in with a woman who stole her powers, lies in intensive care. You plan to pass her aura, the very symbol of her life, onto someone else so that the Fall Maiden's powers would abandon the woman that stole her power in the first place. That did it." Ashbin stared at me wide-eyed as he dropped his cane in raw, utter shock. "I don't believe it." I broke Ashbin. How?" was all he could mutter. As much as I was tempted to say lucky guess, I knew I had to put this poor guy out of his misery if I wanted to get back on his good side and have him as an ally rather than an enemy. Remember what I said, this world was nothing more than a show for my world's entertainment. But now that I'm actually here, I can say it was more a vision into this world's future. I can already tell you that future has been altered." "Altered?" That fixed him, somewhat. He was still recoiling from having one of his biggest secrets blown, but I could tell he was able to think clearly enough to understand what I had to say. "How was it?" "Altered?" was all he asked. "You remember the day that you came up to Blake and offered her a chance to attend Beacon Academy instead of being jailbound for 4 years, how that whole incident that triggered it came to be?" He nodded, prompting me to continue. "Well, that never should have happened. The Grimm that attacked the train weren't supposed to be there. Blake was supposed to be the one that cut the dust carts from the engine as she rode it back to Vale, leaving Adam behind. And that Kamakiri Grim, I didn't lie when I said it was made specifically to fight me. Salem knows that I can absorb the essence of Grim and views me as a threat now. She'll send her cronies to try and do me in as soon as possible. Mentioning Salem must have triggered something as his eyes widened even more before his serious, stoic expression returned. And how, pray tell, can you absorb the essence of Grim? He questioned me as if daring me to answer it. I stuck a hand into my jacket and pulled out the GGD before putting it on the table standing up on its insert side. With this, I started the Gashat Gear Duel, a device not of this world, much like myself. Unlike me, however, it did not come from my world either, rather, it came from a television show I enjoyed from a country called Japan. It is a device that can transform me into Kamen Rider Parody X-. As I said this, realization hit me hard. Which is supposed to be a secret, that I blew to 10 people already. I held my head low in embarrassed shame. Ah, crap baskets. Rest assured, I will have all involved parties held liable for keeping the information regarding your identity confidential unless advised otherwise, Mr. Richardson-Ashbin stated, being quick on the uptake as ever. Or would you rather me refer to you by your alias to simplify the process of becoming accustomed to your new name? I'd rather try to get used to my new name, sir. And that was an honest answer. I don't want to forget who I was before, but I had to get used to being Dicrospectrum for the time being. He made a grab for the GGD, but before he could even touch it, I slapped his hand away after I nabbed the device myself. Don't! I yelled out. If you or anyone other than me even tries to fiddle with this thing, it will unleash a threat infinitely more disastrous than the Grim ever will be. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow and asked what could possibly be worse than the Grim. If only he knew. The Bugster virus. I can't give the exact statistics on how it works, but I can tell you the basics of what it can do. He motioned for me to continue as I put the GGD back in my jacket. The virus itself is dangerous, but what comes from it is even more so. The virus came around from corrupted and mutated video game code that can infect a human and then got spread by a madman, and that's the TLDR of it. T-L-D-R. He repeated slowly, as if trying to understand it. I simply chuckled and said, it's an acronym, it means too long, didn't read, and is mostly used to describe phrases or descriptions that are heavily summarized in their size. Anyway, the actual virus infects a human via a corrupted game where the victim starts to suffer weakness, pain throughout their bodies, and even random bouts of passing out. As this gaming illness progresses, the victim's body deteriorates into code and is transformed into what is known as a bugster. The bugster is a monster based around certain characters or aspects of whatever game the virus came from and cannot be heard except by other bugsters or a Kamen Rider. I looked around the office for a second before asking, is there a chance I can get a seat or something to sit in? With a nod, Ashbin pointed to a few chairs that were situated by a small desk with a pot on it. Well, that's convenient. I thought to myself sarcastically as I walked over and grabbed one before setting it in front of the headmaster's desk and sitting in it. What happens to the patient if this virus fully forms into a bugster? Ashbin asked as I sat down. I turned to him and stated, simply, they die. Exactly, though. I can't really say as it might not apply to this world. Normally, the data from someone that has perished via becoming a bugster or getting a game over trying to cure their virus is transferred to the Proto-Gashat. The game's data originally came from a Proto-Gashat is a prototype of the game it's meant to be. How does one cure the virus? Was his next question. Simple. They have to clear the game the bugster came from, but it has to involve the bugster in some way. The most common way of doing this is by destroying the bugster, which is something only another bugster or a Kamen Rider can do. You talk of bugsters as if they are not all on the same side. Do they have personalities of their own if formed enough? I simply nodded at him before speaking again. Of course they do. Bugsters are just as variant as people. Though most of them tend to seek the destruction of humanity, some want to be left alone and exist, while some want to actually help humans. There was even a rather benevolent bugster who had his game cleared without having him destroyed just so he can keep his victim safe, but, at the same time, there are those who just seek to hurt others for their own amusement. Sounds to me like that is more in common with our human/faunus relations. I shook my head slightly at this before speaking. While that may seem true, more often than not the bugster will seek to do harm and cause destruction. Anyway, once the victim is cured, no trace of the bugster virus is found in them. The GGD, that's what I call this. I pat my jacket where the GGD was before continuing, is a gas hat that is loaded with a lethal dose of the virus. What happens if anyone tries to use it is that the virus skips forming the bugster and destroys the user's body. Or at least that's how it normally is. I take it something happened with yours? You can say that again. I stated in a deadpan voice as I looked down at my feet. The GGD didn't destroy my body when I first used it, but damn did this thing hurt like a monkey humpa. I suddenly heard a snicker as I looked back at the headmaster who was trying to look innocent, glancing to one direction with a small smirk on his face. So Ozzy does have an impish side. I thought to myself. Normally, the base level of either form is 50, which is quite high compared to the normal level 2 or 3 forms and the rarer level 4 and 5 forms. Mine, however, started out at level 2 in both forms and I had to work up to their current levels, Knockout Fighter being level 20 and Perfect Puzzle being 21. There are also other differences, but for the sake of confidentiality, I'm going to withhold that information. Ashvin merely nodded with a small smile. Evidently he either thinks I'm nuts or he's actually glad I'm not telling him every little thing for once. Now then. You said you had complicated reasons for not seeking out civilization? Now this was as good a time as any to test his metastability. Tell me, Professor, have you ever heard of the butterfly effect? As he shook his head in a negative, I nodded and began to explain. It is a rule in the chaos theory that states the smallest changes can drastically alter the present and the future. It was named after a claim that killing a butterfly will change history. Me simply existing here has caused this to happen. Then that makes you, Mr. Spectrum, a pivotal piece of the puzzle in this scenario. Come again? I asked, confused. What I mean is that because of your appearance and your actions, this world is now both safer and in greater danger than ever before. The way I see it is you are now the key to either its salvation or its destruction. If what you said is true, then we now have a chance at surviving an upcoming war dash. I'm afraid that this is no longer a war, Mr. Ashvin. I interrupted him. He looked at me with an eyebrow raised as I looked at him with as serious and stoic an expression as I could muster. After a moment, he motioned me to continue. The moment I became Kamen Rider Para DX was the moment this war became a game. And there are rules to each and every game that must be obliged, otherwise it will result in a game over for everyone involved. As of this moment, everyone on Remnant is playing the game and the only way to win is to survive. I might not have wanted to say that since it makes me sound like a villain of some kind, but it was the truth. The enemy will view this as a game and the only way to win is to survive as long as you can. And that isn't just because your device is themed around a game, isn't it? He asked. The world that it comes from revolves around games as its primary theme. I nodded before telling him, yes, although the GGD is actually 2 games instead of just 1. Either way, you are correct. I see. Then we'll play by these rules as best as we can. I nodded and asked if there was anything else he needed to know. His reply made me cringe a little. Only to know if you have your aura unlocked. I shook my head uneasily as he nodded in understanding. Then we now have our first objective. Until then, I have a proposition for you. I thought in dread, that's not good. Because of your interference, intended or otherwise, Team JNPR is lacking a true team leader since there are 3 candidates to choose from in Team RWBY, while having a leader candidate in Ms. Rose, needs an evaluation to determine if she is, indeed, fit to lead, he began to explain. This is where you will come in. Oh no. I thought as I could sense trouble was brewing, though didn't know how I could feel that, before asking, how so? Until further notice, you will be my eyes and ears for both teams. Your task will be to determine Ruby Rose's qualifications to lead while simultaneously evaluating and nominating a leader for Team JNPR. You will have a minimum of 3 months to perform this while we seek out a means to unlock your aura. If you have unlocked your aura before this time, however, you will still have the remaining time to finish your task before being assigned to one of the teams. Is this acceptable? So, in other words, I started hesitantly, you want me to babysit both teams. I was expecting some kind of remark that made my observation seem like an oversimplification, but I was wrong in having to essentially guide both teams through a whole term holding their hands. What I got, however, was a smirking nod. You fat, conniving monkey humpa. I bet this is payback for me breaking you earlier. I do, however, have a suggestion. He stated as he picked his cane back up, I would recommend having someone you trust wholly and unconditionally to unlock your aura for you. That got me to thinking about how John got his aura unlocked by Para. That whole ritual thing might be my best bet, but who would I trust unconditionally to do so without mucking it up big time? Only one name came to mind as I nodded. I have someone in mind, I told him as I stood back up. Then we'd best be on our way to the medical wards to inform Team RWBY of this development, he said as he too got back up and started for the elevator. Meanwhile dash. Third-person POV dash. Several minutes had passed since the now Team RWBY entered the medical ward. The room itself was a typical solid white room with 2 rows of beds with dividers and curtains between them with a door in the back leading to another hallway, presumably to more equipped rooms that can handle surgeries. Team RWBY minus Weiss were sitting in a small section of the room vacant of any beds or dividers, in their place being chairs and a desk, where they discussed amongst each other. So anyone else worried about what happened out there before the initiation? RWBY asked in concern. Yang merely shook her head in a negative as she gave her answer. I'm more worried about what happened during initiation. Didn't anyone else notice what Daikro did when he destroyed both Grimm? At this, the other 2 girls nodded. I don't really think it's anything to do with Daikro himself. But that device he carries, Blake deduced, you noticed how he used it to remove his armor, change his armor's form, and effectively power up his attacks, right? At the girl's nods, she continued. Perhaps that's the real culprit of whatever caused him to absorb the Grimm after he destroyed them. I'm a bit more worried about what he's capable of. You heard him, he said he scared off the Grimm and made them move out of the forest when you did your, thing. Yang interrupted, but hesitated as she referred to her Faunus partner's train hijacking. I did, and I also saw what he did without it, or did you forget that he bent a solid metal armrest? She asked her blonde partner and her little sister. Oh, I saw. RWBY started, scared me thinking he hurt himself. Nervously, she picked up her cloak and began to fiddle with it before continuing, and then there's that Grimm that Blake, Weiss and I encountered, the Kamakiri as he called it. That. She shivered as she thought of what it did to Weiss' leg. If such a Grimm was meant to fight him, and it's still lost, it's all the more reason to try and get to know him. Yang nodded at her partner's words before adding her own thoughts into the mix. We also know this much, he's still no different than any of us, he's still just a kid deep down, you didn't see it, but he was scared to even visit here with us. I had to ask Professor Ashpin that someone else see him. Both girls looked at the blonde brawler in shock as she said this. I just think it might be worth it to get along with him if nothing else. There's a bit more, still. Blake began, did you notice those scratches on his arms and face? If he had an aura, those wouldn't even be there. It was now the Faunus' turn to be stared at in shock. You mean he doesn't have his aura unlocked? RWBY asked, almost afraid of the answer she was going to get. Blake's nod was all she needed, though, to have her fears confirmed. Then, just how powerful will he be if he does have it unlocked? Rubes, think about it, her sister interrupted as she put a hand on the younger girl's shoulder. He saved you and Weiss in the forest and then saved you a second time back at the temple. If he meant any harm, then you would be back there with Ice Queen and I'd be trying to lob his head off. Right. I still owe him for that. Then it's settled, Yang said as she put her hands on her hips. We help him around Beacon as much as possible and try to be his friends. I'm not so sure Weiss would appreciate that. RWBY interjected. She might have to, Ruby, Blake said as she got back up and looked at the door. She might not think it, but she owes it to him as well to try and get to know him. I've also been thinking about something. When asked what by both girls, the fondest girl sighed before replying. Didn't anyone else notice his hair twitching on its own when he was zoned out? Unfortunately for her, both girls shook their heads to confirm that they didn't notice. She sighed again, but this time out of frustration. If I had to guess, that wasn't hair at all, but really antennae for a faunus. I have a hunch of what kind he is, but I still need to know one last thing before I make any final conclusions. Ruby was the one who asked, "What's that?" How he survived in the forest for so long. He had to have found a way to sustain himself somehow. Hunting without any form of weapon alone would be tricky enough. As she stated this, Daikro and Ashbin entered the room, the headmaster catching the attention of all three girls as they did so. "Ladies, I have an announcement to make involving you and Ms. Schnee when she is released," he started. "This will also apply to Nora Valkyrie, Piranikos, John Ark, and Lyren, though as they are not at the time present, they will be notified upon arrival." "What news is that, Prof?" Yang asked oddly curiously. "You will have to find out, Ms. Xiaolong. For now, though, if you have any questions for Mr. Spectrum or myself, feel free to ask them." Blake was the first to speak up as she asked, "I actually have something for Daikro. I want to know just how did you survive in the forest for so long? There isn't that many hunt-worthy game out there due to the grim presence." At this, Daikro shrugged as he closed his eyes and faced away for a second. "Not sure. I only had a few berries and a stream to keep me sustained." "When was the last time you ate?" "Yesterday," the dichromatic boy answered. "Why?" "Then you should be famished by now." "Aren't you hungry?" Kinda, but not really. I mean, I can go for a lil snack or something, but nothing heavy." Blake pondered on this as she nodded her approval. "Looks like I found out what you are, Mr. Spectrum," she thought to herself. "What is that thing you used earlier?" Ruby inquired as she looked him over trying to find the device on his person. His reply, however, wasn't what she was expecting. "The gas hat gear duel, or the GGD for short. Don't ask how it works, because I don't know. Can I at least try I-NO? The poor Reaper jumped at the shout, whereas Yang got up and was ready to punch the midget in the face for yelling at her sister like that. "Hey, what's the big idea? She only asked you a question." "I don't know exactly how it works, but I do know that anyone who uses it besides me gets killed by it. That's not something I want happening to anyone." This caused Blake to look at the boy in concern and Yang's expression to change from anger to guilt. "Sorry, I didn't know you were trying to protect her," she began, "but you didn't have to shout at her like you did." "I'm sorry, too, but the sooner I can curb her curiosity on the subject, the better off she'll be." His apology was enough for Yang for the moment, but she still kept her violet gaze on him warily. At that moment, Weiss was wheeled into the room from the back door by a nurse before they placed her onto the bed closest to the rest of her team. The girls then tried to bombard the poor heiress with questions but were interrupted as Ashbin spoke. "Ladies, now that you are all here, it's time to make an announcement. From this moment on, you will be known as Team RWBY, led by Ruby Rose." This news shocked all present, but none more so than Ruby herself as she stared at the man with an open mouth before being blumped by her sister as she cheered, "I knew you were special, sis." However, the girls turned to Ashbin as he started again. "Due to the circumstances of Ruby's nomination for leadership as well as a lack of a nominee for leader of the soon-to-be Team JNPR, I have devised a plan to help evaluate her qualifications as well as those of Team JNPR. While your leader may be Ruby Rose, she and Team JNPR will be monitored and evaluated by Mr. Spectrum here for the remainder of the term. Until then, he will act as the true leader for both teams." The girls all stared at Daikro in wide-eyed shock while Daikro, himself, glared at the man who had made that announcement. This year, Ashbin thought to himself, is going to be a headache. Chapter 8. Learn something new. Third-person POV-. The remainder of the day had passed with little incident aside from Team JNPR being told of their situation of lacking a leader as well as announcing all the new teams for the new year. As such, they were also notified of Daikro being a sort of overseer for both them and Team RWBY. Needless to say, a carrot-topped, hammer-swinging ball of energy was greatly against this at first, claiming that she would pop some skulls and break some legs if she didn't get an answer as to why their team didn't have a leader of their own. When told about the circumstances of Daikro's appearance as well as the fact that his identity as a Kamen rider was to remain a secret, she reluctantly agreed. Team RWBY were also held to the same stipulation that they keep Daikro's identity as Para-DX a secret, to which they agreed immediately. Lacking space in either dorm, Daikro requested to sleep in the hall as he had been used to sleeping outside, much to both teams' chagrin, save for Weiss and in some part Blake since they understood why, as no one wanted to see someone have to sacrifice like that just for the sake of comfort. The next day came as the bicolored teen yawned as he stretched, waking up to see the sun had barely started to rise. Typical. He thought as he stood up, sleep in a forest for 3 nights and you'll never wake up late again. Looking around, he tried to discern just what time it was, but couldn't find a clock anywhere nearby, not that he was looking all that hard anyway. Deciding that it would be better if he stayed productive, he chose to do some simple and quiet exercises in the form of push-ups, crunches, and squats. Needless to say, he found out all too soon that there was an early riser amongst Team RWBY, and it was the last person he expected, Yang Xiaolong, whom had caught him in the middle of one of his squats as she giggled. This caught the teen by surprise as he blushed and bolted upright before he turned to face her as she asked, "What are you doing?" First person POV-. Of all the people to be an early riser. Why, oh gods, did it have to be Yang? I was in the middle of my 46th squat when I heard her giggle behind me and ask what I was doing. I practically jumped in my skin with the heat rushing to my face as I stood up and turned around to catch her in her PJs, a simple orange tank top with her burning heart emblem in red right smack in the middle and black, low-cut shorts that may as well have been underwear. I turned away embarrassed even more at the sight before I nervously replied, "IW was simply doing some morning exercises." It always embarrassed me when any of my siblings or my mom caught me doing any of my morning exercises, let alone the ones Yang caught me doing. I never could explain why though. Guess I just was never too fond of showing off. Anyway, I asked her, while still looking away from her, if there was a reason she was up early since Ojpin gave the new teams an extra day off to get acquainted with each other. Her reply got me off guard, however. "I'm normally up before RWBY, and she's an early bird," she started off. "Someone has to keep her in line while we're here. Besides, I wanted to get a head start on knowing someone else on the team." Hoo boy. This is not going to be fun. I was still trying not to look at her even when she asked me, "See anything you like?" I hid my face in my hands in a groan of sorrow which prompted Yang to laugh a little before I punched either side of my head. Evidently, this wasn't what Ms. Punsalot expected as she asked if everything was alright. Third person POV-. She couldn't help it, she loved seeing guys squirm when they were around her and she hadn't had them in some vice grip or anything. Seeing Daikro continuously try to look away from her simply made her laugh because it meant her own charms were working. At least she thought they were as she posed with a hand on her hip and one holding her head with the elbow resting on the wall as she asked, "See anything you like?" She laughed and smiled a little as she saw him cover his face and groan, but that laughter and smile vanished as she saw him punch himself as hard as he could. "Whoa, hold on there, you alright?" She asked with concern as she thought, for once, that she overstepped a boundary she didn't want to. He sighed sadly as he closed his eyes and replied, "Not really. I just was reminded of home just now." "So that's what's up, huh?" she thought to herself as she put a hand on his shoulder. "Dude, look." She started, "If you want to talk about it, I've got more than one ear open. At least I think I do." She play-picked her ear as she said this last bit before smiling and saying, "Yup, both ears are working," popping the P sound as she said yup. "Thanks. I just..." He hesitated as he thought of what to say. "I have an older sister and brother who are twins and... well, they tend to make things as awkward as possible." They always called it twin sanity, and one of the things they would do was that my sister would just bound right in, nothing but her underwear, and hug me from behind while I was doing something, shouting good morning as loud as she could before my brother would come in and say something that got me teased by my sister. They'd always ruffle my hair because I'd never look at her when she does that before leaving me to my misery afterwards. He gave a sad smile as he looked up at the roof before continuing. They always played pranks and jokes whenever they had the chance. Makes me miss them. What happened to them? She asked. Daikro simply shrugged as he said, beats the bananas out of me. 1 minute I'm going to bed, thinking of my baby sister's birthday party, and the next I find myself waking up in the Emerald Forest. Though he left out the fact that his appearance changed along with his height, since that would only arouse more suspicion. This brought an angry rise out of the blonde brawler as her violet eyes turned red and her aura started to flare up before speaking. You were kidnapped? How else would you explain it? He simply asked her. This caused the young woman to suddenly drop her aura as her violet eyes returned before asking what he meant. What I mean is, how do you explain how I got to that forest when I was asleep when I'm from outside the Four Kingdoms? Her anger was now vanishing as confusion seeped into her conscience. She started, but was interrupted by a now smiling Daikro. Either way, I'm here and not home. So I'd best make the most of it. Right? That question sounded so much like her own life choices, to just go wherever the wind takes her and just deal with things as they come. That was part of why she wanted to be a huntress in the first place, the freedom of going wherever her whim takes her and to do some good along the way. I guess, but it's still not right, she stated as she shook her head. Is it any less wrong if I wasn't looking for someone to help in the first place? He asked, catching her off guard as she raised an eyebrow. What do you mean you weren't looking for someone to help? She asked, were you trying to avoid everyone? In a sense. Daikro started, yes, I was. Sadly, events I put into play put everyone at risk, so I had to intervene. You can see how that turned out. There's no arguing that, she thought to herself, if he hadn't been there, then RWBY would've. I don't even want to think about that. By the way, the dichromatic boy said, interrupting her musings, I need to ask a favor of you. A really big one. This caught her attention as she went on high alert internally, thinking he was going to try and take advantage of her for saving RWBY. He may have saved her life, but she won't just give him something like that for free. And that would be? She asked cautiously as her eyes narrowed at him. You wouldn't happen to know the ritual for unlocking one's aura, would you? Her eyebrows did a good impersonation of her hair as they went up and hid in it. Yeah? She more asked than answered, but proceeded anyway. Why? She could see he was nervous about something as he fiddled with his thumbs and lightly blushed. I'd like you to perform it on me. Her eyes widened in shock at this, which was soon washed away in a wave of relief. That's it? She asked internally, that's what he's asking for in return? Geez, now I kind of feel bad for thinking he wanted to do something else. He really must not have anyone here he can really trust. I really hope I haven't stepped over any lines I wasn't supposed to. Were the worried thoughts of the hallway's only other occupant. His thoughts were interrupted as he heard the reply, sooner said than done, kiddo. But I have to make sure, is this what you want? You're not gonna go trying to make a scene out of it or back out and find someone else, will you? He shook his head at first, thinking she was referring to the latter question, but then nodded vigorously as he realized she was still talking about if he was sure about this. Then, you're gonna have to look at me for a few minutes, she told him. His eyes opened wide in shock before he closed them and shook his head. Yang by this point was getting to the limit of her patience before remembering what he had said. Is he afraid of looking at me like this? She asked herself before deciding to try another approach. Okay, you don't have to look at me, but you have to at least face me, otherwise this won't be good for either of us, she explained. She got a nod as Daikro turned to face her, his hairs twitching a little as she closed the distance and sat him down with herself following. She placed a hand on each shoulder and closed her eyes as she rested her forehead against his. Her aura materialized around her and moved to envelop Daikro. I haven't done this, even for RWBY. She thought in concern but pushed forward with the hope that she would do it right as she began the incantation. For it is in passing that we achieve immortality. Her words echoing in his mind as both of them felt an oddly pleasant chill run down their spines before a warmth began to build within their chests. Through this, we become a paragon of virtue and glory to rise above all. The aura around Daikro began to change from its yellow color to a vibrant red and dark blue, almost spiral in its patterning. Infinite in distance and unbound by death, I release your soul, and by my shoulder, protect thee. Between them formed a single, thread-like golden aura that stretched until it touched where their hearts were as their auras slowly faded. As they both opened their eyes, their first sight was the golden thread that lingered, even after their aura faded, for a few moments before it, too, vanished. Too enthralled by what had happened, they stared wide-eyed at the space where the thread had been before the bicolored boy blushed and turned to the side. Yang looked up at him in surprise and saw that his scratches were healing up rapidly. Whoa! Yang whispered to herself, the image of the golden thread still fresh in her mind. What does that mean? The blonde brawler shook her head and looked at her dichromatic friend before asking what he meant. That thing, he replied nervously, the one that was, on our chests. What does that mean? She shrugged lightly before shaking her head in a negative as she said, not sure. Well. Daikro began, you need to get back inside, I'm sure more than one member of your team's an early riser. At this, she felt something building inside she rarely felt, if ever, embarrassment. Embarrassment over what, she didn't know. But what she did know was that it didn't feel like it was her own. She chuckled lightly and patted Daikro's shoulder before saying, if that's your way of telling me to get dressed, I'll be right back out. Besides, we have to stop by Vale City and get you some clothes or something. Yeah, and maybe a haircut, was his reply as he tugged at one of the hairs. Seeing this made Yang flinch as she got up before she turned to the door of her team's dorm and went back inside. First-person POV I wonder what that was all about. I mused as I thought about the incident that just occurred. I looked down at my arms to find all the scratches from when I was in the forest healed up right fast, so I knew my aura was now active at least. The only problem left was learning how to use it. I suggested to myself that maybe pulling a page out of Mr. Miyagi's book would do me some good. I sat cross-legged on the floor with my hands on my knees as I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing. Trying to clear my mind, the scene with the thread kept appearing in my head, and the more I tried to push it out, the more I kept thinking of it. Eventually, I gave up trying to push it out and instead focused solely on that thread. What does that mean? I asked myself. I've never seen it in the actual show, especially since it never happened with John and Pyrrha. So then, why did it happen with me and Yang? Do we? My musings were cut short when I suddenly felt frustration. Why was I frustrated? I was only confused for the time being, and now I'm suddenly frustrated at Blake for some reason. This is going to get confusing really fast. Meanwhile, Third-person POV Blake had woken up and looked around the room after rubbing her yes to find that Yang had run off somewhere. Thinking she had gone to the bathroom, the young Faunus woman decided now might be a good time to catch up on some reading until RWBY and Weiss woke up. Reaching the nearby dresser, she opened the top drawer and pulled out a black book with pinkish-red cursive writing that read Ninjas of Love. The series was her favorite to read, despite the negative connotations it's gotten, simply because she could relate to the characters' issues. She opened the book up and read a few of the passages before the room door opened up, revealing a confused blonde-haired girl in her PJs. She looked up at her partner with a raised eyebrow and asked, is something the matter? Wah? Nah. Yang replied half-heartedly as she asked, what makes you think that? The fact that you're denying something's wrong and that you just came back in from doing something with Daikro, she stated in a deadpan voice before genuinely asking in concern, what happened out there? Did he tell you anything? Only that he was basically kidnapped in the middle of the night from his sibs and dropped smack in the middle of the forest 4 days ago. Blake's eyes widened in shock and horror. The fact that someone would just kidnap someone else like that wasn't all that alien, so she would have understood it if he had been kept as a slave or as some sort of ransom, but kidnapping someone just to leave them in the middle of a grim-infested forest was a whole other level of unusual. Why would someone do that? She asked, her only reply being a shrug of her partner's shoulders. Did something else happen? She was morbidly curious. The one day she spent around Yang, she could tell the girl was as open as a well-read book, yet here she was walking around like a lost puppy. Was she taken advantage of? She thought before her partner finally spoke. Yeah. Something odd. When asked how odd, Yang continued, he asked me to unlock his aura, but it doesn't get odd there. Before that, he wouldn't even look at me. Maybe it's because you're half naked in front of a guy? The blonde brawler mock laughed at Blake before speaking again. Very funny, Blake. But that was when I learned he has family back where he came from, and after that, he asked me if I could unlock his aura. I said yeah, I can, so I did the thing, and then this weird thing happened. The cat faunus eyebrows shot upward in shock before she asked, what weird thing? I dunno. Yang replied, grabbing one of her outfits from the closet before continuing. It was like I felt something in my chest, not heartburn, mind you, that would have hurt. This didn't. Anyway, when I looked down to see what was going on, there was like this string. A string? Blake asked almost too excitedly. Yeah, it was kinda like coming out of my chest and dicros at the same time. What color was it? Blake inquired. Externally she was still in shock, but internally she was screaming like a bloody schoolgirl. I swear if it was gold, then I am not going to be reading Ninjas of Love for a long time, she thought to herself. I think it was like gold or something. Why? That did it as Blake's hands covered her mouth to hide her small gasp. She couldn't believe it, her own partner was going to be the center of a rare phenomenon. I don't believe it. She exclaimed in her mind as it was running 1,000 miles an hour. Blake? Was that a bad thing? She got a negative as Blake shook her head side to side. Was it a good thing? This time, she didn't immediately get a reply. I'm not telling, was Blake's response. This made Yang frustrated at her partner as she stared in disbelief. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, what are you hiding? If you don't know already, you'll have to find out on your own, Blake said as she gave a small smile and pretended to resume reading her book. The blonde brawler merely frowned and growled lowly at Blake before going into the bathroom, holding her outfit, and closing the door to change. The cat faunus simply smirked as she looked at the bathroom door and thought, Yang, you have no idea how lucky you are. Finding your soulmate is no easy task. Later dash. First person POV dash. Man. Today was weird. First, Yan unlocks my aura and we saw this golden string on our chests. Then when both teams came out, I started getting these weird looks from everyone. It started out with Blake, who almost looked giddy every time she looked at me, then Yang eyes me up every now and then like she's just as directionally challenged as I am in where this was going. Then, after talking to Blake, Nora starts giving me the stink eye. Meanwhile, Ruby, Weiss, Ren and John look at me like I'm supposed to be some sort of performer, and Pyrrha, well, Pyrrha's the only one who hadn't looked at me unless she was talking directly to me, namely because I think her mind was wandering elsewhere. The actual shopping was embarrassing. People thought I was Red's little brother or something. I couldn't go anywhere without being called cute or short. I couldn't find anything even halfway decent in terms of size and comfort because half the time Ruby or Nora would tell me it looks bad, like they have any room to talk, and the other half was because the clothes were either too big, were child sizes, or too expensive. After all, I had no money. I mean, yeah, Weiss did offer to pay for the clothes, but I wasn't going to be that snark little leech that just rings her bill sky high. Eventually I just gave up and said I was going back to Beacon. Yang followed me because she was going to be bored if she stayed, so, yay me. That started a chain reaction which got Blake following because she, and I quote, wanted to see how it would turn out, Ruby following out of loyalty to her big sis, then Weiss following because she had to keep Ruby in check. And then John followed because of Elsa, and then the rest of Team JNPR soon after. It was good to be back in Beacon. When we got to the dorm, I rummaged through one of the drawers on the dresser near the door and found a pair of scissors which I grabbed and carried with me to the bathroom. If anyone needs me, I'm cutting my hair, I told everyone. The only reply I got was Weiss saying, "Don't leave the hairs in the sink, please. And if they fall on the floor, pick them up." I closed the door behind me and turned to the mirror on the wall before tugging down one of the long hairs that was on my forehead. The other one twitched for a moment, or at least looked like it to me, but I shrugged it off and brought the now open scissors to it near the same length as the rest of my hair before I heard something outside and started to feel panic? He's doing what? At that moment, I heard the door burst wide open as Blake and Yang, both with expressions that would look more at home on someone watching a gory horror flick. What are you doing? Blake was the one to ask this. I simply looked at her like she had grown a third head before replying, "Cutting my hair?" Both girls looked at each other in wide-eyed shock before turning back to me. "Daikro," Yang called out cautiously. "What do you think you are?" "A human. A really stubby human, mind you," I replied, "but a human nonetheless." How? The Nico started to say before she shook her head and turned back to me. "Never mind. Daikro, do you remember what happened on the bullhead to Beacon from the Emerald Forest, how you dented that metal armrest?" As she asked this, I vaguely remembered it but nodded regardless, still lost by what was going on. Even among faunus, that kind of raw strength is rare without a semblance. She explained somewhat slowly. Again, I nodded dumbly as she continued. It's almost impossible for a human who hadn't had his aura unlocked to be able to have that much strength, let alone someone of your stature. So? What, you think I have a semblance before I had my aura unlocked? I asked. She shook her head and continued. That's impossible, for without access to one's aura, one's semblance would forever remain hidden. What I mean is, you're not human. I glared at her as my eyes began to narrow. What do you mean, I'm not human? I asked almost threateningly. I swear if she calls me a freak alien. Well, the alien part would be right, but the freak part one won't put up with. You're an Amphanus. This caught me by surprise as I stared wide-eyed at her once more before Yang spoke up, though I wish she hadn't. You weren't about to cut off hair. You were about to cut off your antennae. At that realization, I couldn't take any more. Everything just suddenly turned black. To be continued.